So, good evening, everybody. It's ever so nice to see so many people coming together from across the diocese. I love the hellos in the chat. That's always good fun. People saying hello to each other. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome Austen Ivereigh back from last year, where he promised he'd come back and tell us about the second assembly of our synod process, which has been going on since 2021. So good evening, Austen. It's lovely to have you.
Great to be back.
And you went down so well last year that one parish even did a whole day on this video presentation. So we're hoping we are recording this evening. So if you don't want to accidentally appear on the recording, then do switch your cameras off. That's absolutely fine. And the structure that we're going to have this evening is that Austen and I are going to share a bit backwards and forwards because since last year, unexpectedly got asked to go to the Synod as a facilitator, which meant I got to have the amazing privilege of being part of this process as well. So we're going to share backwards and forwards a bit, just to share what are the main outcomes, what has been the process, what was it like being there in Rome, and what are we going to take away as a diocese? And then we'll have some questions at the end. So do stick your questions in the chat as you go along. We'll pick them up, and we'll also be able to sort of take any questions then a bit later on, if that sounds okay. So Austen, would you like to just tell us a bit about yourself and your involvement in the Synod process, because you've been involved in it right from the very beginning?
Thanks, Avril. It's lovely to be with you. It's lovely to be with everybody. And the difference between this last year and this year is that Avril isn't just inviting me on. She was, of course, at the Synod and had actually a more important role than me because she was a facilitator. I've been a humble expert, so-called theologian last year. This year, I was helping out more with the communication. So neither of us were members of the Synod in the sense that we could vote and speak, but we were there to assist the process. And that's really what I've been doing from the beginning of this journey, because back in 2022, so after the initial diocesan phase, the bishops of England and Wales asked me to be part of the synthesis group, synthesizing the fruits of the listening from all the dioceses. And I was then later involved in Frascati in Italy, doing the same thing, but for the whole world. Our job was to read all the 118 Bishops' Conference reports and do a synthesis. And then I was invited to be part of these last two assemblies. So yeah, I've been part of this journey really from the beginning, and it's been a huge privilege with plenty of ups and downs.
Thanks, Austen. And I think one of the things is that you are very close to Pope Francis. You've been written his biography. You co-wrote Let Us Dream with him. Do you just like to? I'm throwing an unexpected question at you now, but not one that you're very capable of answering. Just share a little bit about what do you think Pope Francis's vision for this whole process was, and do you think we got there?
Well, I spoke to him. I mean, just like, any of us could go up to him, couldn't we, during the assembly? If you sort of arrived 10 minutes early, and, he just during the coffee breaks, he was just there, and people just went up to him, give him a hug, give him a present, whatever. So I just very briefly spoke to him at the end, actually. It was, I think, the penultimate day, was on the Saturday. And he just said, he first of all wanted to know what my experience was like, because I shared with him what it was like last year. And he just said, I'm really happy with the way it's turned out. And he did. He looked really, really pleased. So I think there's probably a mixture there of relief. I think there were moments when, and you'll remember this in this assembly, Ivereigh, when, it seemed impossible that we would produce a final document. And I think there was a lot of intervention, from him and from his people to get it across the line, So I think there were some hairy moments. So there was a sense of kind of relief, but I think enormous satisfaction. And really, his speech made this clear. The Spirit has been present in this process, and we set out on this journey to listen to the Spirit by listening to each other. And we ended up with this document, which had just such a clear, consensus behind it, convergence behind it, which sets this direction now for the Church to become synodal. And he said, look, I don't need to do an apostolic exhortation. So I ought to explain that normally after synods of bishops, there's what's called a post-synodal apostolic exhortation issued by the Pope. usually about a year afterwards, or less, but sometime afterwards, in which, as it were, the Pope responds to the proposals of the Synod by saying, "Here's what I want you to do." Well, this time he said, "I don't need to do this, because the church has spoken, and this has been such a big and lengthy and elaborate and wide-ranging process. And there's been an authentic discernment here. And here's the result." And it's almost like, he recognized, which was really important, he recognized this as a process of the Spirit. And so therefore, in a sense, he said, the Spirit has spoken, now go and do it. And so I think the whole way, I know that's what that they wanted. They hoped for this. But the fact that he was able to do it, I think, said in a way that answers your question. It said everything that the Pope said, the Spirit has spoken, go and do this. So I think he will be very, very pleased with the result.
And there was that moment, I remember, like, we'd kind of spent this whole month, everybody was absolutely exhausted, everybody just wanted to go home. We'd done all the voting, we had the speeches, and there was the moment where the Pope said, "We're not going to have an apostolic exhortation." And I just remember looking at the people around the table, and everybody was just going, wow, wow, we couldn't believe it, that no more kind of politics or having to take stuff away and think about the wording, but actually what we'd just voted on and had been approved was just going to go straight into church teaching. And then we stood up to sing the Te Deum at the end, and people just spontaneously gave the Pope a standing ovation because they were so excited. And the people, I was the same, people were weeping around the table. I mean, it was such a moment, it was so moving to have been part of that, and just to get the Pope to say, this is by saying that there isn't going to be an apostolic exaltation, he's almost saying, like, there's nothing else I need to say. Like, this is it. This is where we got to. So it was an exciting moment.
What he actually said, just so everybody knows, is what we have approved is sufficient. There are already highly concrete indications in the document that can be a guide for the mission of the churches in their specific continents and context. That's why I'm making it immediately available to everyone, and it's the reason I said it should be published. In this way, I wish to recognize the value of the synodal journey accomplished, which by means of this document, I hand over to the holy faithful people of God. So this is the first time this has happened since the synod was restored by Paul VI in the 70s. So a hugely historic moment. And look, as you say, we felt it, didn't we, in the room, that joy, that peace, that relief. I mean, it probably was partly relief, but that people have said, and the Pope has said from the beginning, this is not whatever you may think of it and what people want it to be. This is not a parliament. We're not setting out to debate and resolve issues. This is an experience basically it's an experience of the Spirit. And that's why people, synodality can only be talked about so much. Ultimately, you just got to do it and experience it, because when you do experience it, then you come away saying, this wasn't actually about us. This was about the Spirit. And that's the sign.
It's very, very special. So Austin, I'm going to ask you now to take us back and to kind of give us that guide through the 3-year process and just remind us of this long old journey that we've been on.
So what I'll do is I'll share my screen like that, and then press play. And this is just an image there, or various images of the Synod Assembly that we've just been through. And you'll see Avril there at the top. I'm at the bottom there next to the new Cardinal-elect Timothy Radcliffe. I'll come back to this picture, but I just wanted to show you that. But just to remind you that what we've been on is a 3-year journey, unique 3-year process, which has been all about learning how to become a synodal church. So the unique thing about this process is that, as it were, the process is also the subject of the synod. Synods usually focus on topics, but the topic in this case is synodality itself. And so, as you know, the process began in 2021 with the national or local stage, and then moved through these various phases, the continental stage, and then into the universal stage, but constantly kind of coming back as well, because it's been all about a deep listening. And this is the biggest, really most extensive listening ever conducted by any organization in history. It has involved literally the whole church. I mean, even if the percentages of Catholics actually involved might be, I don't know, anywhere 4, 5, 6% of mass goers, but nonetheless, these are historically unprecedented numbers. And So we've been through these stages, and one part of the stage has been an experience of what they call assemblies of the people of God, which were held on 7 different continents. Again, this is the first time this has ever happened, and where each bishops' conference, national bishops' conference, sent delegations to a regional assembly, which was made up of priests, lay people, religious, but not bishops, although involved bishops. And so that was a unique thing. And then each of those assemblies produces a report, but also sends to the Synod of Bishops, which is then held in the universal stage last October and this October, sends delegates, 10 in each from each of those assemblies. And those delegates were definitely not bishops. They were, mostly lay people, religious, a few clergy, and men and women alike, and young people, and so on. So the unique thing about the synods, the Synod of Bishops that was held last year and this year, is that for the first time, a Synod of Bishops had 25%, a quarter of the members of it, not being bishops. There was a rather wonderful expression, juridical expression, which is not endowed with the episcopal munus, which I kind of wanted to put on a T-shirt, but a quarter of the members were not bishops for the first time. And as I say, delegates from all over the world. So otherwise, those present in the assembly, I'll get back the picture, were bishops sent by the bishops' conferences of the world, and according to how big the bishops' conference was, they had delegates. So, for example, from England and Wales, we had 2 bishop delegates. From Scotland, there was 1. However, the Pope also appointed certain people, so we had an extra bishop. Nick Hudson Bottom left there, standing to the left of Timothy Radcliffe, the auxiliary bishop of Westminster, was a papal pick. So that sort of confuses things a little bit. But basically, what you need to understand is that this assembly was made up of mostly bishops, with a quarter for the first time of non-bishops, but everybody had a right to speak and to vote. There were 368 members in total, so that's not including people like Avril and me. So the members who had a right to speak and vote were 368. Then there were about another, I think 70 odd facilitators and maybe another 30 theologians. So what the result of the 3-week meeting, which began with a retreat, a 2-day retreat led by Timothy Radcliffe, we then met for 3 weeks, and using the conversation spirit method, which Avril will talk about in a minute. And the result of this assembly was this document. As I say, it's about 50 pages. And it is it was approved by the assembly massively, and it has 5 sections, and it provides what I would call a roadmap for synodal conversion. So it's a setting, a direction for the church, which, as you've heard, was endorsed immediately by the Pope. So it's become papal teaching immediately, which sets a roadmap. And what follows now, because even though the synod as an event has concluded, the synod as a process goes on, we now enter into the implementation phase, which is really about its reception by the national bishops' conferences and, of course, by dioceses and deaneries and parishes. And what's important about this document is that it both defines and understands synodality and explains, as it were, how we do it, how we get there. And I will speak in a bit more detail about it after Avril's come back on the method, but I just want to share with you 2 paragraphs, just because I think it will help your understanding of what we're talking about. And the first one is paragraph 28, which actually is a very long paragraph. I've just taken a couple of sentences out of it, because I think what it does is supply probably the best definition or understanding of synodality that we've yet had, because, of course, this journey over the last 3 years has also been about growing in our understanding of synodality. And you can see there that it's really, to understand it at its most basic, it involves gathering. There is an assembly. We come together for mutual listening, for dialogue, and community discernment. And discernment means discernment of spirits. In other words, we are trying to understand in discernment what it is that the Spirit is asking of the church. And part of that process is because an assembly isn't merely to discuss, it is actually ultimately always about action. What action do we take in response to what the Spirit is asking us to do? And the way we find that out is through what they called in the assembly convergences, or we would say a more common word would be consensus, which, by the way, is not unanimity. It's not everybody agreeing with everybody else. But over time, through these processes, this thing called a consensus emerges, which brings, as it were, which we recognize as being a fruit of the Spirit. And that, if you like, provides the guidance to where the church needs to go. And then at the end of the paragraph, it says, look, in simple and concise terms, it's a path of spiritual renewal and structural reform. It's both things together that enables the church to be more participatory and missionary so that it can walk with every man and woman. The other paragraph I wanted to share was, let me move on, which it won't. There we go. Is paragraph 43, which is on synodal spirituality. And I can't stress this enough, which is that synodality is a spiritual process. That's why it's not like a political process. It's not like democracy. It might have a lot in common with those things, but it is primarily, as it says here, a spiritual disposition. So to enter into synodality or synodal processes, we require a mindset, an attitude, a disposition of the heart and the mind, which is described here in terms of humility, a patience, a willingness to forgive and to be forgiven. But when we come together, we come to listen to each other and to share and to propose what is on our mind, what is on our conscience, but to do so without trying to win an argument, without trying to impose a view, because ultimately we're understanding that this is a process larger than us into which we enter into. And this is something which we learn by doing. And that's why the experience of the last 3 years has been so important. But also it does require, as it says here, formation and spiritual direction. So this is not something, this is something we need to learn, experience, but we also need to learn how to do. And that's something that the document comes back to again and again. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Avril, back to you.
Excellent, Austen, thank you. Just going to let you, there we go. And I'll just add me back on. There we are. So, Austen's given us a great kind of reminder of the 3-year journey. We in Diocese of Northampton have been on that journey. We remember the original listening. Do you remember it in the COVID wave? That was the Omicron wave of January 2022. And we were doing it in the dark and the cold, and people weren't turning up, and we were feeling very sorry for ourselves. And then I remember reading in this amazing document, Enlarge the Space of Our Tent, that the church in Haiti said, despite the ever-present threat of violence and murder, we managed to meet. And then I stopped feeling sorry for us at that point, because we were only battling through an English winter, and what other parts of the church, the lengths the other parts of the church went to be able to do this was absolutely amazing. So we've been on that journey as well with our Diocesan Assembly and with these practices of conversation in the Spirit, kind of becoming, slowly becoming embedded in our diocese, which is very exciting. But just to say, so how did we go about this? What did we do for the month? My children kept saying, "What are you up? What are you doing, Mum?" And I said, "Well, basically, we're trying to write a document with 350 people." At which point they went, "Oh, okay, now we kind of get the scale of what was needed." And we use this process of conversation in the Spirit. And you've seen Austin's picture of the sitting in those round tables. I remember the first time I walked into the aula, the hall, I was very sort of awestruck, because we'd seen these round tables the year before, and they're very iconic of the listening. And it is, you're literally sitting around. I was on an English speaking table, and that's English speaking at its broadest. And it was the most incredible experience of the global church. So on my table, and one of my tables, I had 2 different ones over the course of the month. I had a deacon from northern Syria. I had a redemptorist religious and theologian from Sri Lanka. I had an Archbishop of Ethiopia, Archbishop of Southwark, Archbishop of Tokyo, the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago, Michael Zerni, who's prefect of the Dicastery of Human Integration, Archbishop of Tanzania, another Japanese laywoman and a female Australian theologian. So you can just imagine just the breadth of the conversations that we were having around the table. And at one point, we were talking about migration and the impact of urbanization and migration in the world and on the church. And so we had the Ethiopian Archbishop and the Archbishop and this theologian from Sri Lanka talking about what happens when your economy collapses and everybody comes in from the countryside, floods into the churches in the cities, and then a year or two later is moving on. And then you've got John Milson, Archbishop John Milson, the Archbishop of Southwark, saying, well, yeah, they're kind of, some of them are washing up on our shores, you know, on Dover Beach. And at the same time, we had Michael Cerny, Cardinal Michael Cerny, who's, as I say, the prefect of Dicastery for Human Integration, who looks after migration on behalf of the church, saying he had just got an agreement for all the Episcopal conferences from Colombia all the way through to Canada, that they would all treat migrants the same way, so that migrants going up the main migration route on the west coast of America would always receive the same treatment when they turned up in a church. So I was sitting there thinking, gosh, I cannot imagine where else in the world you would be able to have a conversation like this. It was so, and it was very, very positive and framed in a very hopeful way. And people were speaking about the impact, the positive impact that migrants had on Western communities, for example, but also then the Ethiopian Archbishop was talking about how they were supporting their own parishioners when they were working, for example, in Saudi Arabia, where you aren't allowed to practice as a Christian, and they were supporting them through WhatsApp messages and prayer groups and things. So the whole thing was an amazing experience of the global church. And the conversation in the Spirit method, which we do use in our diocese, we used it in our assembly preparation, where you've got this very strange way of being in conversation, which involves lots of silence and lots of listening. And that first round where you go around the table and you just hear from people. And that it was a very compelling way of having a conversation. And one of the things that the conversation in the Spirit does is it doesn't matter if you're a cardinal or a layperson, doesn't matter if you're a native speaker or a non-native speaker, doesn't matter if you are a person who's quick to speak or somebody who needs a bit more time. Everybody had 3 minutes. Everybody had 3 minutes. I was telling Austen before we started that my phone, if I picked up my phone, it would say Siri suggestion 3-minute timer, because I basically spent 4 weeks putting on a 3-minute timer for people to speak. But it was amazing because everybody's voice was heard. Everybody's voice was heard around the table, and this sort of leveling of power meant that everybody was able to meet in a common space. That was actually a sacred space. It was a holy space where we were listening and engaging with one another. And one of the things that really I was very impressed with, obviously I wasn't there the previous year, was that people who came were really good at being participants. So one of the things that we've been doing in the diocese and with my other hat on for the School for Synodality is training facilitators. That's really, really important. But what the people there were also really good at being participants. They were good at only speaking for 3 minutes. They came with their ideas nice and sharp and interesting. They were good at listening to one another and helping people who didn't have who weren't native speakers. And one of the things that we were doing as we were going along is we were writing proposals for each part of the document. And when they disagreed with one another, they had ways of holding the disagreement, not falling out, not polarizing, but actually being interested in what the other person was saying, to the extent that this never failed. We always managed to write a proposal which reflected everybody's views, even when we had really different views on the table. So for me, it was a real experience of the movement of the Holy Spirit. And sometimes some of the conversations, I mean, you'll see the document is a very practical document. It talks about, how do Episcopal conferences relate to Roman dicasteries, which kind of back in the diocese feels like a really kind of obstruse kind of and technical thing, but actually it was a very important conversation to be having around the table. But that these conversations were good ways of sorting out problems, They were good ways of being creative and actually hearing a range of voices. And they were good ways of not forcing people into polarized positions, but actually enabling people to find common ground. And I think, I mean, in the world where we're in, which is becoming ever more polarized, that skill of being able to hold multiple viewpoints and listen and engage with multiple viewpoints was really quite spectacular. And as I say, on the table, we had that combination of cardinals, archbishops from around the world, lay people from around the world, religious, with a real range of different experiences. And somebody said to me at one point, isn't this just like a bunch of Western do-gooders getting together in Rome? And I said, are you kidding me? This is the most diverse group of people I have ever been in. And it was a bit like the UN. You'd be standing in the coffee break, and you'd be sort of turn around and talk to somebody, and they were the Bishop of Denmark or the Archbishop of Montreal, or, you know, there were all kinds of people that I got to speak to as I was going. But these are habits and practices that we can take into our own diocese and in our own communities. And I just came back thinking, this is a really good way to be church. This isn't just some sort of great kind of notion of Pope Francis that's a bit trendy at the moment, or even something that's emerged from the council, from the Second Vatican Council. It's actually just a smart way for us to be responding to a rapidly changing world, rooted in our Catholic faith, holding these complex sets of opinions around a table and being able to listen to each other, discern. The Holy Spirit was definitely moving. There were moments where it was very blocked, as Austen said, and then there were moments where you would just feel it just open, and people were open around the table and you could make progress. And so, yeah, it was very, very exciting. And I think one of the most beautiful things, one of the things that I really, really enjoyed was when we went into silence in our table. Obviously, there were 36 tables around the room. And so when you went into silence, the other tables around you were not necessarily in silence. And what you could hear was this, like a murmur, in all sorts of different languages, people talking about all sorts of different things around the room. And it was like hearing the voice of the people of God. It was just like this. You kind of would sit back and you just close your eyes and just get into silence. And just, you know, it was just amazing. It was like the gathered people of God speaking. So something very, very beautiful about that. So I'm going to hand over to Austen now to talk about where we actually got to in terms of those proposals. Austen, you are muted, I'm afraid.
I seem to have to, anyway, not to worry. Good, you should be able to hear me now. Yeah, okay. So I want to go back to the document, but also to go into it a bit more, but also just to back up and mention a document which is extremely important prior to all of this. It came out in 2018 from the International Theological Commission, and it was on synodality. It was the first major theological, magisterial document on synodality, and it's cited at the beginning of this final document, but it makes an important distinction between three kinds of meaning of synodality. The first is a particular kind of style, a particular way of being, of living the life and the mission of the church, assembling, listening to the word of God, treating each other with great respect, listening, creating space for the other. With these keynotes of co-responsibility and participation of the whole people of God. This is not a sharp division between clergy and laity. The idea is everybody, all the baptized, contribute to this process in differing ways with differing roles and ministries, but from a shared baptism dignity. So that's the first type, the style, if you like, of the church. Secondly, in terms of processes of decision-making and discernment, which are really kind of the same thing. So when the church is making decisions, when a parish is trying to decide, well, what's the vision for our parish, or a diocese wants to know, how do we move forward? The idea is that you come together in these assemblies and have these processes of the sort that that Avril's just described, what we were doing in Rome, in order to find out, as it were, where the Spirit is calling us to. So the way that we exercise our authority in the church is marked by these processes of consultation and discernment, but transparency and accountability. The idea is we consult and so on. Now, the bishop is the one tasked with making the decision for the diocese, just as the Pope is the one who is ultimately going to make the decisions on behalf of the universal church. But the idea is that these decisions are taken by authority after lengthy processes of decision making that involve people very broadly. So that's the second meaning of synodality: processes of decision making and discernment, and as a way of making decisions and governing. And thirdly, synodality refers to particular events such as the Synod of Bishops, which we've just been through, as well as sort of standing structures like pastoral councils, diocesan councils, and so on, in which the church regularly assembles, presided by the bishops, to deal with particular questions and to take decisions. So these are these three distinctions. Actually, if you now look at the slide there, look at the title of the final document, you'll notice that parts 2, 3, and 4 really correspond to those three kinds of synodality. So the first section is on the conversion of relationships. That's part 2 there, on the boat together. This part 3 is on the conversion of processes, and part 4 on the conversion. Now they call that bonds, but in fact it's about the bonds between particular structures in the church, like, for example, the way the papacy relates to the bishops' conferences. So what I wanted to draw your attention to is the fact that in each of those titles is the word conversion. So we are talking here about a conversion from one way of being to another way of being. And so the assumption is that if you like, we are not synodal at the moment, and we are called to become synodal, and that involves a conversion. Now, the Pope spoke, and here's where the past 3 years has been truly significant, because of course it's only by experiencing this that we understand what this conversion is. So if you like, the past years has been a school of synodal conversion. The Pope spoke in his speech. He referred to this time marked by wars, in which we are called to be witnesses of peace by learning how to live out our differences in conviviality, is how it was translated. And later in his address, he said, the address that he made right on the last evening after the document had been voted for. He said, "Dear brothers and sisters, what we have experienced is a gift that we cannot keep to ourselves. The impetus that comes from this experience, of which the document is a reflection, gives us the courage to witness that it is possible to walk together in diversity without condemning each other." Now, you might think that's quite a small starting point. Can we walk together without condemning each other? Because his point is that this is something that the world finds increasingly difficult. And of course, the Synod concluded on the 26th of October, a week later, or 10 days later, we had the US election, where we have these two completely different visions of the country, two different political parties, but almost different world views, incapable almost of talking to each other, of listening to each other, of understanding each other. An election which sort of hangs on, the thread of a few 100,000 votes, and an election which sort of overturns things. And the one thing I took from the US election is that, as a way of proceeding, as a way of doing politics, if you like, it's a disaster, this. It produces maximum stress and uncertainty, maximum instability and so on. And this is increasingly, of course, what we're discovering more and more in the world, that institutions are failing to contain the differences. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, which we won't go into, don't have time. But the point is that what the church is doing here, yes, is for the sake of the church, but it's also a vital witness in our time to show that differences can be made fruitful if we learn how to walk with each other and listen deeply to each other. and we learn how to make space for the Spirit, then actually we show that there is another way of being. So let me just go a little bit more into these three conversions. Conversion of relationships in part 2. For me, the great thing about this section is it's really, to use a word that the Pope uses, it's about declericalizing the church. So, the church in the modern age is still really overshadowed by a late medieval and aspect of modernity as well, in which the church very much was divided into two classes of people, the clergy and the laity, with the laity being basically passive. And even though Vatican II overturns that theologically and ecclesiologically, in reality, it continues to operate really according to that model. So a synodal church is one which really takes seriously the people of God, as the church, as the people of God, in which there are a variety of charisms and ministries, all in the service of the mission of the church. So what needs to happen for this to be realized is a church which really does open up to, or really the idea that the Spirit is pouring forth gifts on all the baptized, and that all the baptized are called to take part in the life and the mission of the church. So it's calling for a church in which we all take part and we all participate in our different ways. And there are relationships of equal dignity and reciprocity, but it's also a conversion of relationships in the church, so that the way we treat each other and interact with each other becomes, if you like, a reflection, or is a reflection of how God relates to us, or indeed Christ relates to people. So there's quite a lot in that in that section about the way Jesus relates to people, always making them agents and subjects, listening deeply to them, and so on. So that first section has a lot about the discernment of vocations and charisms, and it has the famous paragraph 60, which you probably have read about, which is about women, saying that calling for the full implementation of all the opportunities with regard to the role of women. There is no reason or impediment that should prevent women from carrying out leadership roles in the church. What comes from the Holy Spirit cannot be stopped. So this idea that the Spirit is pouring out gifts on women which need to be recognized. And it says that the question of the diaconal ministry, the openness of the diaconates, the women, remains open. We can go into that in the Q&A, but that was an important thing for that paragraph to say. So that's part 2, calling for really the exercise of co-responsibility. And then we have part 3, the conversion of processes, which is all about putting discernment at the heart of the decision-making and governance processes. So understanding that when we're not a corporation in which there are a series of bosses handing down orders, but rather that the authority of the bishops, the authority of those who govern the church, is rooted in a collective listening to the Spirit. And hence the importance of these processes, of which might seem a complete waste of time, as it were, in the wider world, but are absolutely fundamental if we are to create space for the Spirit to guide the church. So the call for all kinds of participatory processes, namely councils, pastoral, presbyteral, diocesan, national, continental, and so on. And it's very, very definite, this part, by saying without concrete changes in the short term, in other words, immediately, to enable synodal decision-making processes, the vision of a synodal church will not be credible. Very, very definite about this. We need these processes now. And in fact, saying we insist that things like pastoral councils, diocesan councils be made mandatory as requested at all stages of the synod process. Not just these standing bodies, but if you like, the regular habit of assembling in order to discern. So, and then part 4, the conversion of bonds, as it's called, or an abundant catch, is about the way the church relates to spaces, and it's a really interesting section because it recognizes that the way that we inhabit spaces now, is very different. That the whole understanding of place has changed, and that has a lot of implications. We think of the church as really the parish, rooted in a place, whereas in fact, in practice, people just move around much more. They belong in lots of different ways. And so it talks about here the impact of mass migration, the important rise of digital culture, and so on. Now, this is all about having a church that understands that it is on mission, that it is all about opening out to listening to the seekers and nurturers. It's not enough, as it were, to continue with this, what I might call service model of church, where we turn up on Sunday to receive something and then kind of go away again. It's a very, very more missionary contemporary image of church. The church not as a closed space to be defended, but a home of hospitality that welcomes and includes in these new contexts of mobility and interconnectedness. And then the final part is really about formation for missionary discipleship, understanding that formation is key to all of this, that we as the ordinary baptized, we need to receive formation of a biblical and theological and but also in a very practical way, learning how to do these processes, learning the art of facilitation, ministries of listening and accompaniment. All this is going to require, this isn't in the document, this is going to require a significant mobilization of resources or reallocation of resources in the church. And that's why this process, of course, is going to be a process of a whole generation now. But it's a very, very interesting section at the end, a call really for all kinds of overhauls also in the way that we form, for example, priests, the way that formation should involve lots of different kinds of people. Again, breaking with this model, which so many people have inherited from the past of a sort of two-tier church. So, and in which there's also a very, very important role, of course, for catechists, for leaders and preachers of the word and so on, is all absolutely crucial. So, if I can just end on one other aspect, have I got time, Avril, or shall I stop there?
No. Go for it, Austen. People won't want
Okay,
to
so
stop.
this is the other thing that has come out of the synod, which is mentioned in the report, but is part of the ongoing moving into the future that the synod has established, and that's what are known as the 2 commissions and the 10 study groups. And I mean, let me put it this way: there are many complex issues which have been raised in the course of the last 3 years, which require need going into. They can't simply be discussed by an assembly. We would be there forever. Some of these require a whole synod assembly on their own. So what the Pope has done with these issues is to say, look, these are all key issues to do with becoming synodal, which we need to deal with. So what he's done is created these 2 commissions and 10 study groups, which are going to proceed in or are already proceeding in a synodal way. That's to say, in a way that's open and transparent and dialogical, in which we have study groups made up of people from across the world and so on. And the Pope said of these that it's because more time is needed in order to arrive at decisions that involve the whole church. And he made clear this is not about postponing decisions. This is not kicking the can down the road. He's saying, actually, this is how we need to go about dealing with these complex questions, listening, convening, discerning, deciding, and evaluating. So those are the issues there. I've just put them up there on the screen. I won't read them out. But as you can see, some of them are extremely important. The way bishops are chosen, what ministries are closed and open to women because of the confusion of the priesthood with governance, the way we deal as a church with complex ethical issues. These are big topics, and these study groups, we had a chance during the assembly to engage with them, and I must say it was completely fascinating, and I think it's going to be really, really interesting. So all we know so far is that these groups are going to report to the Pope next June, and they will be, as it were, their conclusions will be part of, will feed into this process of implementation, which is all about becoming synodal. Back to you, Avril.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Austen. So I've got excited all over again. Just listening to you talk, listening to you unpack that document is getting me all excited again. And one of the lovely things is that we have a bishop in Northampton, David Oakley, who this is his vision for church. And right from the beginning, I remember he said to me, I've been teaching ecclesiology for 30 years. I've been teaching the council church for 30 years. And now we get to do it in the diocese. And so everything that we have been doing is kind of in the document. We are several steps in some ways, and not in everything, but in some ways we are kind of leading the way, which is very exciting, although there's a lot left to do. But really lovely to know that all the hard work that we've done over the last few years is, really encapsulated within what Austin's been describing there, and giving us a vision. And the original strapline for the synod was for communion, participation, and mission. And so in our diocese, we had our diocesan assembly. We now have a diocesan pastoral council, which we haven't had for about 15, 20 years. We are now bringing in pastoral councils into every parish. So we've got a starter kit that we are piloting at the moment. And I was saying before that I had a call with some of the people who were involved in the pilot scheme last night. I have never heard people so excited about parish council meetings in all my life. I was absolutely astonished. They are loving it. And it is a way of coming together as pastoral councils, which is deeply rooted in prayer and spiritual reflection together, and then it outpours into action, then just really wanted to crack on and see our churches transform and grow in that way, which is really beautiful. And then the other thing that we are doing is trying to bring in these ways of being church, these more synodal ways of listening to our pastoral planning, to our thinking about the future. And next Thursday night, we will be gathering with Bishop David in Aylesbury to conclude a 9-month listening process that we have been piloting there, where we are looking into the future. And rather than our future planning being based on a priest dying or moving and oh my gosh, there's nobody to replace them, we've got to twin that one with somewhere else, or a church's roof going or something like that. Actually discerning together on the ground. In Aylesbury, we listened to over 400 people in 16 different groups. What do we need in order to be the best Catholic community that God is calling us to be, to face the future together, to be that kind of the participatory and missionary church that Pope Francis has that vision for. So that's being piloted at the moment. We will do that everywhere around the diocese, and so there's that vision. But there's also a list of jobs in that document that I've got to kind of sit down with and work out, how are we going to do this? Because actually there's more calls for transparency and accountability in there. There's more of the exploration of the synodal spirituality. There's more exploration of leadership and thinking about synodal leadership. How does that work? So there's rather a long to-do list, but what's lovely is that we're on the journey. And as a diocese, and it may not feel like that in particular places, I do know this, but that as a diocese, we are on the journey with this. And we have a bishop who's really committed to it, which is very exciting. So Austin, we wanted to give people a chance for questions. And so we're just going to, I meant to add you rather than replace you. Sorry. There we go. I wanted to just pick up on some of the questions, and I can see that we've had a few questions come through. Danny wanted to know, will we be able to use the recording in the parishes? Absolutely. Please use this recording wherever you like and share it. And we will put it on the diocesan website. We'll also send the link to everybody who signed up for this call this evening. And so please feel free to use it how you like. So Austin, one for you from Pete Collins. Do you think synodality moves us in the direction of conciliarity?
So conciliarity or conciliarism refers to the medieval, of course, movement by local churches in a way to curb the power of the papacy. I would put it this way. I would say synodality moves us in the direction of a healthy decentralization, and those are the Pope's words rather than mine. And you'll see in the latter part of the document, there's some discussion about that. So the question, if I can summarize it, turns on what is appropriate for the local churches to discern and what is appropriate, as it were, for the universal church to agree on. And of course, this issue came to the fore with Fiducia Supplicans in December last year, which you may remember, the Vatican document allowing for the blessing of people who are in same-sex relationships, not the blessing of the same-sex relationships themselves, just to be clear. Africa, as you know, rejected it, but they didn't just say reject it. They actually went to the Pope, discussed it, and said, look, we're not questioning the doctrine, but we can't implement it. So there's obviously still some discussion about that. Another example would be Amoris Laetitia, which some bishops' conferences had real problems with. So those are some of the questions, and they're difficult questions because, of course, we need a gospel challenges local culture. We can't just simply adapt to local culture in everything. On the other hand, the gospel needs to be enculturated, and so this is a major ecclesiological theological question or tension that in practice needs to be looked at, and it is being looked at.
Thanks, Austin. Just to say to people, do put your questions in the chat if you've got things that you'd like to ask. We've got time for 2 or 3 more, I think. I mean, one of the really interesting conversations we had around our table on this was actually some really quite practical things like translations of liturgical text.
Right.
Where they might be done locally and then they go off to the Vatican, and then what comes back is not necessarily so recognizable, or actually just really, I mean, I think the polygamy issue was something where the church was saying, like, what is for Rome to deal with this would be quite odd. Actually, local bishops know the culture, they know what's going on, they know the context of this. So there's a necessity to, within absolute concrete Catholic teaching, to have understandings of what that looks like. So there were some really interesting conversations about how that could be useful, which was helpful. Rosalind, I can see somebody put the document. Did you put the document in the? We will send you the list of the link to the document out.
Yeah, just be careful with that link that you've just put up there, because that's a German link, which I think would be to the original document that we were given. It's now been revised, and you'll find it at. Let's put the link up there, Avril. We'll put it up there. It's actually on the Synod website.
Yes, I think if I switch away from my screen, I'm going to lose it for the recording.
Yeah, so. No, I'll put it up there.
Thank you. Somebody else said, how enthusiastic are the bishops of England and Wales? Well, I actually, because I was there with another hat on, which is the School for Synodality, which is a national project that we were running. Actually, the bishops were really interested in some of the work that we've been doing around pastoral councils, around actually how do you use conversation in the Spirit in a parish setting, and they were really interested in that work that we were doing, and I know that they were presenting to the wider bishops while they were away in their plenary. So that's really lovely. And I have to say that lots and lots of the bishops were, when they were sitting in the conversations, they were sitting there thinking, what does this mean for my diocese? Like, how do we take this forward? And there were lots of really fascinating kind of concrete examples of how that was being done, sort of how that can be transformative. So the Bishop of Highlands and Islands, Brian McGee, they'd had a clergy formation session, and he'd trained all of his priests on how to facilitate these conversations in the Spirit. And then they had conversations in the Spirit on some of the key issues impacting on the diocese at the moment. And then he'd sent them home to have a go in their parishes. So there's some really kind of creative things that were coming through from there. So somebody has asked, were women happy with the results of the synod? And I think one of the things that we learned in a synod is not to speak for any one particular group, but certainly I know that having the statement that the question of women deacons remains open, that being in the document, was quite a big deal. And certainly when you read the reflection on women, that paragraph 60 that Austen mentioned, it's a very kind of honest reflection of what it is like to be a woman. Like women are often not heard in the church, that their voices are not heard, that there are one of the youngest delegates, Julia, is Polish, but studying in America. So she was there as part of the US delegation. And she said to me, in her diocese, girl altar servers aren't allowed. And so, just things like just trying to say, let's get the fullness of where women are at the moment. Let's make that all available. And one of the things that I discovered while I was there was that women are doing so much in the church and we just don't see it. So there are, across Africa, there are 3 general secretaries of Bishops' Conference who are women, which is an amazing statistic. We haven't had one in the UK since the 1990s. And women around the world are chancellors of dioceses, they are running Catholic universities, they are leading theological commissions, and the women delegates, I don't know about you, Austen, I was overawed by the women delegates. They were amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just add to that. I mean, I think one of the interesting ways in which the question of women's ministries has developed in the course of the synod, and particularly in this assembly, and I realize that, there are obviously a variety of views about the question of the diaconate. For example, for some people, and I think this is particularly true of Europeans and Americans, they will tend to see this as an equality and justice issue. In other words, until women, are clergy in some way, then there's no real equality in the church. But actually, in other parts of the world, you hear something very different, not least from Latin America. And the Amazon, where women basically run the church. I mean, the communities in the Amazon are run by religious women and by lay women. And I remember them saying in the Amazon Synod in 2019, when they described what they did, and people were saying, well, you're basically deacons. I mean, you're doing everything even that priests do. Don't you want to be clergy? And I remember so many of them said, no, we're not interested in being clergy. What we want is the church to recognize what we're doing and give us the authority and the resources to do it. So I think I think at the place, at least this is how Cardinal Fernandez and that understands that Group 5 looking at the ministries, is the first stage of all this, the necessary stage, is for us to understand what the Spirit is already doing in terms of women's authority and ministry, and to understand what are the obstacles to that. Because I think there's a slight danger otherwise that in going straight to the diaconate question, we're sort of reinforcing the idea that the only important people in the church are clergy. And I think that then can become a vicious circle. I'm not proclaiming a view on this, and obviously there were a variety of views in the assembly, but I find it quite interesting that that's kind of where it ended up. What the assumption is, that the Spirit always pours out gifts on the church that it needs to carry as its mission. It is clearly at the moment pouring out those gifts on women. The task of the church is to recognize that, understand it, give it authority, as it were, release and liberate those gifts, rather than going straight to this discussion about the clergy, which is a difficult question because of the role of the diaconate in the early church, which is very complex.
Thanks, Austen. Any other questions or thoughts? While we're waiting for things to come in, Austen, I'm going to ask you, what was your favourite moment of the synod?
Well, I have to say my favourite moment, or the moment, and I wrote about it in the tablet, which was quite kind of thrilling moment, was not actually in the hall, but during the crisis over this Group 5 of Cardinal Fernandez. And without going into the whole story, we were supposed to have there were meetings arranged between the synod members and the coordinators of those 10 study groups, in order to have a kind of a dialogue. And what happened was that Group 5, which was headed by Cardinal Fernandez of the Doctrine of the Faith, he didn't show up. Now, whether he should have shown up it doesn't really matter. But anyway, he didn't show up. But more to the point, he sent these 2 very low-level, rather hapless officials who kind of basically wanted to give us an email and say, and people were really, really upset and indignant, whether they were cardinals or bishops or lay women or religious. Kind of the synod found this, or the assembly, there must have been about 100 of us at that meeting, found a common voice to say, look, this is wrong. We need to have a proper dialogue, almost saying, look, we're a subject here and we need to be treated with dignity. And it was, I described it in the tablet, it's almost like there was this kind of this thing that formed. It's you might call it agency, when, as it were, a body discovers its voice and its, if I can use the word power without being misunderstood, it's power, it's potentia. That to me was the moment that will stay with me from the whole assembly. Yours?
It was quite a moment, wasn't it? Yes, I was in the room when that happened. And then the unfolding of that afterwards, and how
and then all the dramas that followed afterwards, which ultimately were quite positive, I thought.
But it wasn't, there wasn't a silencing at that moment. That was what, and I actually really loved, one of the things that I loved about it was how dynamic the process was. So we, as facilitators, we had a WhatsApp group, and the WhatsApp group included Father Giacomo Costa, who was sitting at the top table next to Cardinal Grech. And when things were going wrong, we would all be messaging on the WhatsApp group, like, this is no good. We can't understand this question. You know, I've got 3 cardinals asleep. What are we going to do? And they changed the process dynamically in
Mm.
order to reflect that. And so we brought in periods of silence, we brought in periods of conversation on the tables. They actually were, it was a very kind of live process, which was quite
Mm.
exciting. And I was talking to one of the German facilitators, and he said, if this was Germany, we'd say, thank you for your feedback. We'll change it next time. But because it was
Mm.
kind of in this Italian, it was quite kind of dynamic and lively. It really did have a feel as if the members of the synod, as you were describing there, Austin, really did have kind of a power in a
Agency.
good
Yeah.
way. They
Mm.
yeah, they had a possibility to impact on the outcome. And one of the, I mean, one of my favorite things is when I read through the document, because people were saying this document's all been written in advance, you know, like this is a total stitch up, it's a waste of time. I tell you, I can go through that document and I can say, I remember that intervention from the floor. I remember that conversation that we had. I remember the modification that my group discussed. And that was the voice of the church, that document. I mean, it's a particular language and it's perhaps quite a complex language. I would say it's not necessarily bedtime reading, but there is something there which is a collective voice of a global church, which is quite exciting,
But
really.
we're not giving away secrets by saying, because many people have spoken about it, the draft document and the final document, there's just a huge gap between them. I mean, the draft document was inadequate, and people said so. And boy, did they get to work, and the writers had sleepless nights, and over 2 days the thing just no, it was I mean, I mentioned that I think the Pope's team were active. I mean, of course they were involved, but definitely the document was the fruit of the assembly, there's no question. Yeah.
It was a beautiful moment where one of the again, I think I can say this without really breaking too many confidences. You spoke about disability in her family, and it
Mm.
was an incredibly moving moment. And then when you see they were saying there's no mention of disability in this document, and then on my table you said, oh yeah, no, I remember our disability group in my diocese sent me to say something about this, and we haven't had the opportunity to do that. And the mentions of disability in the document are there because of that advocacy that
Mm.
happened. It was
Oh yeah.
very exciting. Yeah.
Mm.
John, I'm going to take John McGowan's final question as a final one, and then I think we better stop because otherwise we will just sit here reminiscing all evening, Austin, won't we? Which would be very dull for everybody
Which will
else.
be good for us, but not much fun for anybody else.
John's asking, how quickly is the church going to change? Which is always an exciting. How soon can we expect change in structure?
Mm.
I mean, we know how fast the church changes, and how fast you can change a church is actually partly dependent on us on the ground.
Mm.
Actually, one of the big moments that really struck me was at the end, the Pope was being, as usual, a wise old bird, and he said, this document that we've spent a month reading, hardly anybody outside this group is going to read it, only you lot. But you have to go and be ambassadors for this now. And I've taken that to heart. And I'm going around saying to everybody, I'm saying to all of you on this call, you have to pick up the Pope's call. You have to be ambassadors for synodality. The church will change when we change it. The church will change when we ourselves say, I want a listening, discerning church. I want a different way of being, even if that's quite uncomfortable. And so then what we're bringing in are these different ways of being church that are bringing in things like Lectio Divina at the beginning of a meeting, which just helps people to share their faith in quite an incredible way, and bringing in conversation and spirit practices, bringing in those sort of saying to ourselves, who isn't in the room, whose voices are we not hearing here, holding ourselves accountable, holding to transparent processes. That is a thing which we will live out. But I think, Austin, one of the interesting things was they built some structures into the document, didn't they? Like things like changes to the ad limina.
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to be a bit more sober about the implementation process. And I tell you what, because the question is specifically about England and Wales. And my sense in England and Wales, actually, and I hope nobody takes this the wrong way, there's a lot of business as usual in the mentality of the church doing it, partly because we have so many clergy, which may surprise many of you because they've been talking about shortage of clergy. In fact, we have one of the highest proportions of clergy to people in the world, bar Malta. Cardinal Schönborn of Vienna was saying the same to me at the assembly, that they have more priests than people than in the 1950s, because, of course, the people have shrunk so much. So I think I see synodality already happening across the world. It's happening in Australia, Latin America in particular, Asia, mission places where there are very few priests relative to people, where you're seeing a much greater involvement at every level of the baptized. I think it's harder, frankly, in our country where we have, resources to maintain the set. However, actually, if you look underneath the surface, it's quite dramatic what's happening in England. I do know that the bishops know that it's dramatic. I don't know yet whether, as a body, they have come to understand and see synodality as an urgent necessity. So I'm going to hedge the answer, but I will say that there are a number of dioceses, and yours is one of them, which is taking a lead on this. And we've had synods in Liverpool. The individual bishops, individual dioceses are moving ahead very much. I just don't know yet, at the level of the bishops' conference. I mean, they'll be meeting in a plenary this week. They seem to be only talking to the press about the assisted suicide bill. I haven't seen yet anything on synodality. I'm sure they'll say something. Let's wait and see. But I think it will be a gradual process in this country, much slower probably than in other places. So I want to end on that rather realistic note, but at the same time, I want to back everything that Avril was saying by saying that actually there is nothing to stop the church at ordinary parish granular level from becoming synodal quite quickly, as long as obviously the priests and the deaneries and so on are able to take the pace. Then I think there's no reason why it can't happen quite quickly at a local level.
And I would say, and we are doing this in our diocese. So we're going to run facilitation training in the new year so that anybody in any parish can come along, learn how to do this in their own parish. And we've got these pastoral councils getting established all over the place, and the bishop has asked for this as part of the assembly. I suspect it will be going into canon law as of June anyway. And it works. Last night on the call, one of our pastoral area council chairs said, "I've just introduced conversation in the spirit into our last pastoral area council meeting," and these are literally her words. It was amazing. And so I love that, and I hear that repeatedly. Like, when we go into these conversations in the spirit, you go deep really quickly, they're consequential, they're transformational. So I would say, like, if we do nothing else, let's figure out how to bring that practice into our parishes, and that will be a great start. We're going to have to say goodnight, Austen, aren't we? Thank you so much, everybody, for being with us tonight. Great questions, a lovely crowd as ever. And thank you so much to Austen for coming and sharing and getting me excited all over again.
It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you all for your lovely remarks. And, as the Pope loves to say, go ahead.
Absolutely. Good night, everybody.